Did you know that every time any actor who is featured on Law and Order changes location, they are legally obligated to yell "dun dun" at the top of their lungs? Hi, my name is Jesse, and we're here to talk about video games. Specifically, we're here to talk about Anthem. Now, if the title of the video didn't give it away, I have a lot of issues with Anthem, same as everyone else. There are well-documented problems with glitches, performance, loot, and a general lack of actual things to do in the game. That's not really what I want to talk about, though. All of those things can be fixed, and BioWare has been hard at work to resolve those issues, releasing multiple patches already. The core gameplay loop is really solid, and when there's more than a handful of activities to use your javelin in, with proper loot and fewer bugs, Anthem will be in a much better place. Rather than discussing those elements, which have been talked about thoroughly in many different videos, articles, and endless threads on Reddit, I really wanted to talk about something that really bugged me with Anthem's design that I think will be harder to fix and may cause some serious long-term issues with player retention if it's not resolved. Simply put, Anthem doesn't feel like it was made for anyone. From the loading screens to how the story is handled, Anthem just constantly felt like it was going out of its way to keep me from really digging into the gameplay center of this video game cake. That was a terrible analogy, but bear with me. The clearest example of this comes from firing the game up and trying to get into a mission. The loading screens are painfully long, but the greater issue is how they're arranged. You're forced to load into the hub, walk around slowly, and get all immersed in the atmosphere, talk to NPCs to get missions or contracts, and then make your way to your javelin. It's a slow, cumbersome process that feels like an attempt at immersing the player in the world. Now, I've seen videos on exactly how long this takes, thanks to how slow a lot of the loads are, but I'm not concerned with the explicit length of this, but instead how much of it is ill-fitted and purposeless within a multiplayer game. Whether you enjoyed the story and the characters or not, talking to them in the hub takes a while. This isn't an issue in and of itself. After all, I loved walking around the Normandy and talking to my companions and crew in Mass Effect. Obviously, another famous game from BioWare. But in a multiplayer-focused title, this is suddenly a huge problem. The game immediately presents a conflict between you spending time with your friends in cooperative play and spending time with NPCs for missions or optional conversations. It's difficult to justify skipping even the optional conversations, as they do provide reputation with factions. But at the same time, they don't influence the story of Anthem in any grand way, nor do any of these characters really have stronger ties to the player than just being a background NPC. Your companions are the people that you play with, so to speak, but the NPCs are just so much noise. And damn, they are noisy. Playing story missions with friends proved to be actively difficult. NPCs chatter just so much during campaign missions, that we found ourselves either unable to hear each other speak over voice chat, or we found ourselves talking at random intervals and finding ourselves speaking over one of the NPCs anyway and completely missing what they said. This leaves a big question. How are you supposed to play Anthem? Like, who is Anthem for? Like, how is that player, the person that Anthem was built for, supposed to play the game to get the best experience out of it? Do you play the campaign like it's a single-player game? Do you choose to play with your friends in silence like you're all watching a movie together? Do you just go for it, turning the in-game audio down and playing with your friends anyway, skipping as much of the dialogue in Fort Tarsis as possible? I mean, you might not know where you are or what you're doing, but it's a shooter, so you can probably get by on shooting everything in the face, right? It probably goes without saying that none of these choices are ideal, but I'm going to be thorough and say it anyway. If you play the campaign by yourself, the combat will be much less interesting with fewer potential situations where you can combo your abilities together with other players, something that's strongly built into the core gameplay loop. If you play the game with random people on the internet without voice chat on, you'll miss out on the social elements anyway. You'll also run into some real ding-dongs, as with any online game, but that's not really here or there because it's a universal problem. If you kill the in-game audio to play with friends, then Anthem's story will still take up a ton of your time with unskippable cutscenes, and you'll still end up walking around Fort Tarsis to talk to people to get missions. Slowly walking around visiting NPCs is going to happen no matter what you do. It just becomes a thing of whether you choose to save a little time by skipping the dialogue or not. Oh, and of course, obviously, if you do skip dialogue and choose not to listen to the story, then you lose any context for your actions or any sense of place. which really robs the game of letting the player feel like they belong. You just can't get into it if you don't know what you're doing. At least that's my personal feelings on the situation. And that's kind of where my primary point lies. The game doesn't really allow you to ignore the story to play co-op. It's going to get in the way no matter how hard you try to avoid it, and the co-op is going to get in the way of enjoying the story and getting drawn into the world. I will say that personally I didn't enjoy Anthem's story. I thought it had very poor writing, and the plot felt like it started in the second act of 3 and failed to introduce the world or the villains convincingly. And then, just when it started to get interesting, it ended with an anticlimactic final mission. As far as enjoying Anthem as a game goes, however, I don't think it matters if you love the story or if you hate it. You could completely disagree with me, and I think the central issue I'm talking about remains. The story and multiplayer don't work together. They exist in spite of, not in support of, each other. They don't complement each other. The gap between story and gameplay becomes even more ugly when you consider the game structure. Even Anthem's campaign and curated side missions are regularly interspersed with contract missions that eventually make up a significant chunk of the endgame. Instead of being crafted levels, they give you randomized, generic objectives that ask you to fly around the map, blasting whatever bad guys are at the location in question. You show up for the story, you're forced to play those types of missions anyway. Story-free, co-op focused, randomized levels. And if you show up for the co-op, you're going to have 20 hours of story in the way of actually really getting into the co-op. This brings us to the end game. Once you get through the campaign, the story content almost immediately dries up outside of a few extra side missions. This is expected. At that point, you get to run strongholds, which are curated missions that are slightly more challenging than the usual offerings. You get to run as many of the infinitely generated contracts as you like, and you get to fly around the map in free play. Contracts, however, still end up wasting a ton of the player's time, forcing you to walk around Fort Tarsis to accept more contract missions from the appropriate factions before walking back to your Javelin. Even in the end game, you can't just spend all of your time flying around and having fun. Hey, if you do that in free play, you'll end up wasting a bunch of time thanks to world events that are painfully difficult to actually find, and a lack of loot to be had compared to directed missions. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but it really just felt like you won't get rewarded as well for free play as you will for running contracts or strongholds. Okay, so I think I've explained the problem fairly thoroughly at this stage, explained my position, and shown how messy Anthem's structure is, in my opinion. To follow up on this, I've got 2 statements to make about those issues before we close. Firstly, I don't intend to make the game sound worse than it is. I really don't. There's a ton of negative press surrounding Anthem right now, and I don't want to try and make anyone feel bad for enjoying it or add to the dog pile. I probably enjoyed my time with Anthem a lot more than this video would imply, but that still does bring me to my second point. These issues I'm discussing aren't immediately game-breaking, but they did wear me down. Constant loading screens, an awkward feeling that I neither experienced the story as intended, nor did I enjoy my time in co-op as much as I could have, and constantly having to return to the fort to slowly pick up new contracts and equip new items and weapons just wore me down. I see these issues as being frustrating to most players, not just to me, to varying degrees, no matter how much fun the core gameplay is. It is fun, don't get me wrong, but everything surrounding it is just a drag. Anthem's campaign might be over for me now, but BioWare is going to be adding more story in the future, and it may end up having the same problems. Every time I load into the game thinking that I just want to fly around and blast things, I'll have to go through the same lengthy process of loading screens and walking around Fort Tarsis to see even more loading screens before I can actually take off. I don't find myself hating Anthem, don't get me wrong, but I find myself with absolutely no desire to just sit down and play it right now. And I have little interest in future story updates. It just seems to me like it's a game that isn't for anyone. It's not terrible, but it's not worth spending time on compared to any other game in the same genre, even compared to BioWare's back catalog. I'd rather play the Mass Effect trilogy. I'd rather play Mass Effect Andromeda. Despite all the negativity, I do want to say that I think there are improvements BioWare could make to alleviate all this significantly. I don't really know off the top of my head how they could fix the conflict between Anthem's solo player oriented story structure and the generally multiplayer focus of the game in general. I mean, multiplayer games have traditionally kind of avoided heavy amounts of story for reasons that Anthem unwittingly became kind of an example of. Perhaps cutting out some of the extra contracts, reduce the padding in the existing campaign, and slightly cutting down on the amount of dialogue, conversations, and cutscenes in future story chapters released could reduce the awkward conflict between the amount of time spent on story and the amount of time spent flying around in co-op. But as far as the end game goes, they could do a couple simple things to really improve the general experience, I think. They could spawn the player right in next to their javelin when you first load into the fort, rather than on the other side of the fort, so you don't have to walk to it so far. Better yet, actually, let people go straight from the start screen to the mission select screen, allowing players to pick up new contracts from within that menu rather than in the fort. There'd still be a lot of loading time, but there'd be a lot less of it for not having to load into the fort, and it would cut out that extra fluff that just wore me personally down over the 40-ish hours I've played so far. It would be less immersive or story-focused, admittedly, but it would place that incredibly entertaining flight and combat center stage and allow people to really dig into it. In closing, I'd note again that I really do love Anthem's core gameplay and the general concept of the universe. There are a lot of really wonderful ideas here, and I think BioWare could end up making one of the most fundamentally entertaining co-op shooters on the market, with some TLC and a whole lot of patches. To offer a counterpoint to my previous statements, I would note that I think it'd even be an improvement if they ditched the focus on a replayable co-op centered endgame and went all in on a story with choices, consequence, making it more of a single player game with optional co-op than a co-op game with this big focus on campaign. But either way, I would contend that if they don't solve these issues where co-op players are going to feel like the story is wasting their time, and solo-oriented players get a subpar experience compared to a single-player focused game, then Anthem won't ever really be for any type of player in particular. I'm really hopeful that BioWare will be able to turn this around and deliver something really special. And at that point, this video will be horribly outdated. But we're not there yet. We'll have to see how it goes. Have a good one. And hey, if you play Anthem, fly safe.